name is Geoffrey Edwards.
And I'm Mary Thaler, and this is Writing Off the Deep End.
So, in this episode, we're going to be looking at the issue of world building. We both write science fiction and fantasy, but we also both write historical fiction and even contemporary fiction.
Yeah.
And so we're interested in this concept of world building, not just in the sense of science fiction, but in the broader sense of whenever you write a story, you have to have a clear sense of setting.
You are creating a world.
One of the things when I was thinking about this topic is that it's always research-based. Whether you're writing historical fiction where you're doing a lot of research about places that existed or settings and environments that existed, in science fiction, you're doing research about the science behind the places that you're inventing often. So it's still very imaginative, but you're doing research about physics and the biology and chemistry and these kinds of issues.
I remember being a young writer, like a really young, in primary and high school, and thinking, I don't know much about the world, I better write fantasy, because then it doesn't matter that I don't know about different cultures or different things, and that of course is not true.
Well, and I was thinking about fantasy too, and one tends to draw from existing literature about fantasy, and so there is a kind of a way that one informs one's writing based on existing works.
So what would you say are the details that you strive most to get right when you're creating a world?
Well, one of the things, we've talked about this before, but a sense of the body's, the feeling of the body in space for me is really important. So I work hard at regardless of what I'm writing, that the setting and the environment has a certain weight to it, a feeling of the body in the space, right?
Yeah.
So,
do you find yourself making a lot of sketched maps of buildings and environments and yourself?
You think I should, but I don't. No, it's all up here.
Okay. You don't become disoriented in the spaces that you create.
No, in fact, on the contrary, it's once the spaces start to have a shape to them, I feel more at home. So I'm driven to do that.
Okay. Are there special challenges about creating spaces in your far future?
Well, I mean, we talked about, for instance, in some environments, things may be different than one expects. So, for instance, one of the things that my characters do is they don't breathe because they have this technology that breathes that replaces the normal breathing mechanisms. And one of the reflections I had is, might that not change the way you stand?
Okay.
If you're not breathing, you may, and I think you may tend to be slightly more forward in your stance than you would be normally without breathing.
And that's kind of the essence of world building, is not just creating the environment, but thinking about how that environment is affecting your characters and through your characters, your story.
It's something visceral in a way. I mean, sure, it requires architecture, and things like that. I'm
also working in a world that's very different than the world I see around me. And so getting little details right matters. Details about weather, details about food, what people are eating, because these are all fairly fundamental things about how people live their everyday life that shape how societies are organized. I'm always looking at maps, I'm looking at climate records, and then you have to kind of forget some of it
when you do the writing.
Exactly, because the reader is not interested.
No. How much do you invest to make sure that you get the details right, historically correct, as opposed to taking a certain amount of license in order to move the story forward and not worrying too much about the detail?
I think I have the kind of personality that always worries about the detail. And I might fudge something without realizing, but if something comes up later and I realize I got it wrong, I have to fix it.
Yeah.
So
I think I'm a bit of the same.
So for me, I'm looking at a reality that exists, and I can go and find out what it is, which is a little bit different than a reality that you create. Yeah. I tend to find that the real world is actually stranger and more interesting than what I could come up with from my imagination.
I think that's probably true, but hey, I write science fiction, so I invent stuff anyway, and hope that I do a reasonably good job at it.
So it involves some choices for you. You have to have there been some major choices you had to make?
Well, the science fiction, you have to be consistent, right? So you invent one technology, and then it has consequences. So, I have this, one of the technologies I invented is this device for slowing time.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that has all sorts of consequences, and so all of those consequences become part of the story in a way. But they're interesting.
World building is often taking your idea and following it all the way to the end.
Right. So when I was working, for instance, on this historical fiction that takes place in Poland, I remember doing the research into the cooking dishes that were typical of the time, and that one might actually, because I had an evening party where people were cooking it, but then there was a Jewish person in the room, and that ended up having all sorts of consequences for the story that I didn't necessarily work out ahead of time.
Are there any details that you don't bother, that don't seem important to you?
So a lot of people write historical fiction based on real people who actually lived, whereas I tend to write fiction using using fictional characters.
Yeah.
I think you're basing your work on historical fiction.
Yeah, everyone is a real person. Yeah.
Yeah, and I worry about that. I worry about, readers will want something grounded in reality rather than this purely historical stuff. I don't know, but I worry about those things.
I think that's maybe something you don't have to worry about. There's enough space in history for all of us.
Yeah, maybe.
It strikes me sometimes reading science fiction and fantasy that people put a lot of effort into imagining the higher levels of their society, the royalty or court intrigues, and those can be really fascinating. But I find it more interesting to put that attention to detail into the lower parts of society. I feel like most people through most of history, as indeed many of us now today, vaguely know what's going on politically above us, but mostly we're involved in our everyday struggle, and that's a preference. I also have been seduced by very well-written court intrigues and things like that.
Because I have this idea that because the stories that I write about are in some ways, because they're far future, the environments are exceptional. For us to look at today, they look totally like magic, right? I mean, sort of totally outrageous things that go on.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in the everyday experience. How do you avoid anachronisms? I mean, because that's the danger of doing historical writing.
I'm not sure that you can ever eliminate them totally. And I still remember a dear elderly friend who'd grown up during the Great Depression telling me about a mistake she found in The English Patient about a character who was a nurse and had studied nursing in Toronto in the 40s. Just like my friend had, and he'd gotten something wrong, and she said I could never enjoy the book after that. So, sometimes we have to be kind to ourselves. We're not going to get everything right, but you start to become alert to the kinds of things that matter. And one thing that you can do that I think is very powerful is read books, not just about the time that you're writing about, but written in the time that you're writing about.
Written by authors living in that time period.
Exactly. So I'm writing in 1875. It's quite interesting to go and look at what books were coming out at that time. Jules Verne.
So how people were writing and what they were thinking about.
Yeah, what were they interested in? You can get a sense of what people cared about and were preoccupied with at that time. And that's very valuable for capturing a time period.
I try to do that with my science fiction too, in the sense that I try to invent literatures that don't exist today, but do exist in the future, so that becomes part of their background, right? So
so you have to create the past for your future. Which I think I've sometimes thought about this world building. It's almost as if in writing we're like photographers and we sort of frame our picture nicely, but we're taking a picture of the world and we also have to create the world, and then we have to frame a picture of it.
Yes.
Like it continues past the edges.
But it's also true that in order to create the picture, you don't actually need to fill in the whole picture.
No.
You just need certain elements that are generative of a sense of the whole.
Sure.
Right?
I do think it's true, though, that you will end up creating more material than you will use in the final volume. And not try to take everything that you've ever written and
stuff it in.
Shoehorn. Yeah. That goes in the appendix.
Yeah. I probably have a tendency to do that.
Well, you wouldn't be the only sci-fi writer that did.
Yeah.
You did.
Next time we're going to be reading some excerpts from our own work.
Yeah.
So, we've talked to you quite a lot about what we think about writing, but we've never actually shared any of the text word for word. So
yeah. Feel free to subscribe if you want to follow along.
To our YouTube channel, Writing Off the Deep End. And see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for watching.
Bye-bye.